So Muriel, Duane, thank you so much for taking the time to come talk to us about your new book, The Learning Cycle. Fascinating read. Well, before I get into the book, how are you guys today?
Doing well, thank you.
Yeah, we are
Good.
doing well by God's grace.
Absolutely. And God is good. Um, you know, The Learning Cycle is the main title. The subtitle is Insights for Faithful Teaching from Neuroscience and the Social Sciences. Muriel, could you maybe break that down a little bit at least at the high level? I know a lot of the book from reading it's basically just proving what y'all already knew from common sense. But if you could kind of explain what all this means to the general audience, so we are on the same page as we talk, that would be awesome.
Sure. Well, as career editors, we've always been challenged with the fact that people tend to forget most of what they learn. And beyond that, what they do learn or remember makes little difference in how they conduct their lives. Why is that? Could it be the way teachers teach is not how learners learn? The most recent findings in neuroscience have given us insight into how to teach with the brain in mind. When you teach with the brain in mind, learners are more likely to remember and rehearse the material and finally get it into long-term memory. And that into long-term memory, getting it into long-term memory is absolutely critical for any behavior change, for people to take action. Social science research findings are also clear on what kind of learning helps transform behavior. So in the book, we tend to emphasize strategies teachers can use to help learners move beyond the knowing to the doing of the truth. And then in our subtitle, you'll notice that we also use the phrase insights for faithful teaching. We added the words faithful teaching to indicate that our goal is to be faithful to God's word in teaching.
Absolutely. Yeah, I noticed that it's in there strongly, and that's an awesome piece to put in with it. Um, I mean, I guess what we're really saying is instead of just teaching for people to memorize for a test, is to actually make it where they can remember it and use it practically, right?
Absolutely.
So, Duane, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Well, just the assumption, actually, a couple of points. The assumption that many of us think that we have taught when we have communicated some knowledge or some truth to people. And that's important that people have correct beliefs, but it's not the goal of teaching or discipling or preaching. Not that people just have correct beliefs, but that they have correct living, that they have obedience to the truth, to the knowledge that they've learned. And we can often, as teachers, get caught, or preachers, get caught thinking that because we've talked about something, that ends it all right there. We're finished with our obligation. But the book says we actually can go far beyond that and help people and encourage them into behavior change. That is applying the knowledge, applying the truth that God gives us. What kind of sets apart this model, I think, is because so much of it is based on the functional magnetic resonance imaging science. That's the brain science. They can now track learning through the brain by virtue of this fMRI machine. And the other thing that I just wanted to note here in opening is that this is not simply for Christians or for theologians who teach. We have used this with medical workers in several countries in the world. We've used it with NGOs, churches, colleges, universities of all departments in universities. Seminaries, at least 25, 30 seminaries in at least 3 continents. It was actually one of the requested presentations at the HIV/AIDS World Conference in South Africa, where Muriel made the presentation with some of her medical colleagues. And this was the heart of that. So it's a very broadly applicable design.
That's wonderful. I mean, yeah, you guys did an awesome job. Um, so Muriel, we kind of touched on that the book does put an emphasis on making sure that biblical truths are applied as we're teaching as well, or at least, it continues to have objective truth woven through the teaching process. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, as Christian teachers, we're interested in making biblical truth central to our teaching. We can teach in such a way that our learners will be transformed truly in their minds and their attitudes and their behaviors by God's truth. And so in the book, we offer strategies that contribute to sustaining faith practices that strengthen character and move us toward Christ likeness. We teachers need to help navigate that tricky transition from the classroom to life that Duane alluded to. Too often we assume that they know it, and so they'll do it, like Duane said. It's a huge missed opportunity on our part. In his parable of the sower and the seed, Jesus himself addressed the obstacles to doing the truth, to bearing fruit, barriers that keep people from stepping out and acting. In our book, we suggest that teachers ask the question, what would keep you from doing what God is calling you to do? How do you plan to overcome that obstacle? You notice here the use of questions, the power of questions. Our strategy, one strategy that teachers can use is the power of questions. We now know the questions actually hijack the brain. So when our brains are immediately focused on an answer to that question, if I were to ask you, what color is your house? Immediately, you don't tell your brain to go there. It just does it automatically. And if teachers hope to engage their learners in thinking about changing their behavior, good questions become a powerful learning tool for the gospel and for our spiritual lives.
Absolutely, amen to that. Duane, so as you go through the book, you start off with a couple of chapters getting people into the understanding of where we're going, and then it gets into other chapters that are called levels, back to a couple of chapters, levels, and you finally wrap it up in the final chapter, the learning cycle. Mm-hmm. So we've got the high level here and some of the principles. Could you maybe just go briefly go into some of the more granular or practical ideas of how this all works?
The book was launched largely from Matthew 23, which is a chapter on the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. Jesus never spoke more harshly than he did to these two religious groups, these two religious leaders of that day. They were highly respected, highly trained, highly educated. But in Jesus' way of thinking, they were falling far short because they were hypocrites, a word which is used repeatedly in that chapter. And I got to thinking about the hypocrite factor. I saw it in my own life. We see it sometimes with people, big name people who fail and have their lapses in their Christian faith. And I began to say, what can we do? And part of the book then was launched by this, the hypocrite factor, the disease of the Pharisees and the teachers of law. So then we go back to, how do we move beyond content? How do we move just beyond the knowing of something? Because they were good at that, but they were poor at the practice of it. Well, part of it, and here's the real issue. When we are poor at practicing our belief, we distort the gospel. Because people believe what we do more than they believe what we say. And so our real beliefs out of our heart reveal our beliefs. Our real beliefs are revealed by our actions. So we begin to think about how this can fall out. So level one then comes to the point of, how do we communicate content? And there's several skills that are involved there, like how do we get meaning out of the text so that it connects with relevance to the learners? How do we communicate in such a way that it makes sense to them? That is, they can repeat it in their own words, and therefore they begin the process of ownership. I'm going to come back to that ownership in a moment. What the neurosciences have done is they have told us that when people come into our learning environment, whether we're in a discipling group, one-on-one, pastoring, preaching a sermon, teaching a class, whatever it is, if there are people who have negative emotions, that closes down the part of the brain that has to do with learning, that has to do with thinking, with logic and thought. So what happens is they can take notes, but it's not processing at all. And they can get an A in the class, and that can be absolutely, the 100% of that, 98% can be washed away, depending on what research you use. So then the question is, what do we do to set an emotional atmosphere between me and the party, if I'm the teacher, or in our marriage, or with my children, whatever the situation is? How do we set an emotional atmosphere that is positive, relevant, meaningful? And then the brain is free to engage. The reality is, if you're going through a divorce, you're not going to listen very much to the sermon, unless the sermon is about that topic, which it often isn't. So the emotional part of the brain is very important. The third level is speculation, bringing people to the point of thinking, so what does this mean for me and my life? Now, the big word these days, and has been for a decade or so, is contextualization. How do you contextualize to the learners, to the listeners? And the only way real contextualization, real relevance can come through is if you give them the chance to think about it. So think about what difference this makes to you. Now, educators talk about a silver bullet here, and the silver bullet is rehearsal. So what I've done in my classes is, after about a half an hour, if it's a 50-minute class, I stop and I say, I want you to think about something that's very important, something that was said, even if it's from the book that you read or a conversation that you had. What's really important? What has God put on your heart? Tell your neighbor. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. Now that's rehearsal. That's very different than repetition. Rehearsal is when you begin to own it. And as a result of rehearsal, when you begin to own it, the brain now transfers that memory, that information, from short-term memory to working memory. Why is that important? Because now it has started a neural pathway, which can evolve into and develop into a neural network. As it develops and strengthens, that neural network becomes more and more powerful. So as a person rehearses, and we talk about the ways in which we can create that rehearsal over a series of times, so that eventually that information, that truth that God has put on your heart, moves into long-term memory, where it affects your beliefs. It either introduces new beliefs or it strengthens old beliefs. It can also cancel out false beliefs. Now, why is that important? Here's the big one. Only what goes into long-term memory affects our worldview and our deep belief system, what they sometimes is called in learning, deep learning. It's not the same as in IT, which also is deep learning. So one of our goals then, is to keep the information moving through these neural channels, building neural networks, so that as they are strengthened, more and more God does a work of character development, Christ likeness in us, because not only do we believe something, but we are now acting on that belief. And that is called integrity. It's called character. And I think the Bible calls it wisdom. So that's our goal. So when we get into the barriers, which Muriel mentioned earlier, I have yet to see a teacher talk about barriers to obedience. And yet it's critical. And because we don't talk about it, Satan attacks us at that very place. And therefore, being realistic about it, about what the barriers are, how we can overcome them, and the practice of it, that would be level 4, and ultimately the sustainability of our practices, that would be level 5, becomes very important. Habit.
Yeah.
So now these things become habitual in the best sense. They're practices that are embedded deeply in our character. And our words and our behaviors, our practices, become one. It was, I think it was Gandhi who was asked, what is your message? Can you tell me your message in one sentence? And he said, my life is my message. Words and actions coherently integral.
Absolutely. Wow, it's fascinating. Yeah, I think, as I'd read through and while I was listening to you, I related because, I was a professional student for quite a while. I can't even remember how many majors I had. But the emotional piece is very important because there's times where I was taking a course that wasn't relevant to me and I wasn't interested in it. And I'm like, my gosh, this is a hard course. And sometimes I'd drop it. Sometimes it was, I got through, but it was hard. Later, I would be majoring in that subject because professional students change their minds. And then all of a sudden it was a fascinating subject. I'm like, what an easy course this is, because it just flows into your mind. And I don't think people get how important that emotional piece is.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's fascinating.
In the 60s at Michigan State, there was a big emphasis. Michigan State College of Education was the largest college education in the world at that time, with the exception of Moscow University. And affective education was a big thrust through the whole thing. We've got to touch people at the emotional level because that's where they begin to feel some sense of ownership of material. And then it fell off the table and the next fad came through. But I went back to that. I've always remembered that because, and you've reinforced it now, it is so important.
Absolutely. Well, we're about to wrap up. Muriel, do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the Edge of Faith audience?
I'd just like to mention that living out God's truth requires establishing new practices, and then those practices become habits, faith habits. And a habit is a specific reoccurring thought or set of actions that become so internalized that we repeat it without thinking. It's a default setting. I noticed in your website, in the mandate for the Edge of Faith magazine, that your mandate is where the King says, it comes from Matthew 25:40, where the King says, inasmuch as you have done it unto the least of these, my brethren, you have done it unto me. Jesus calls us to action, to live out his truth daily. And then these behaviors become our default to overrule ungodly options. The research tells us that 40% of what we do every day is unconscious. That means it's habitual. Habit is important. Faith habits are important. And in the parable of the sheep and the goats, it's interesting how Jesus illustrated that their thought habits were unconscious. And yet those habits determined their action. Remember the surprise that they felt, the goats and the sheep, when the king said, when they said to the king, when did you see us? We see you hungry and thirsty. And it was totally unbeknownst to them that their habits revealed their respective motives. Either they were corrupt, as were the goats, or righteous, as were the sheep. So building faith habits is a huge piece of what teachers, Bible study leaders, mentors need to do. Walk alongside the learners and help them think about these things and use questions to hijack their brains and make them think about what difference this makes.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys again for taking the time to talk with us, and I'll hold up the book. All educators and all Sunday school teachers, everyone needs to pick up a copy. And for someone that just wants an interesting read, they need to grab it as well. IVP Press. Thank you guys for spending the time with us and sharing with us your thoughts.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.